Welcome everyone to this week's Nym community call. Ironically, I said that I'm going to be doing solo episodes when necessary going forward. That was the commitment I made for this year, that there's going to be a call like this every week. And then, as I decided that I'm going to be doing solo episode whenever necessary, it became unnecessary in most of the times because I have some amazing guests lined up for each of these calls, which, today's call is not an exception. Today, we're going to be talking about something very important, which is sort of like a centerpiece of what Nym is in more ways than one. So we're going to be discussing the Nym Privacy Statement. And for that, I have with me someone who you already know, who's the communications lead of Nym. Hi there, Casey. How's it going?
Good. Hey, Sudo. Thanks for having me on. And thanks for Walter.
Welcome back to the call. And I also have someone new who is also shaping up to be a really fun guest for today and also has a lot to say about the Nym Privacy Statement specifically. I have with me Walter van Holst, hopefully I pronounced that right, who's the principal consultant at Hooghiemstra and Partners. How is it going, Walter? I butchered that, didn't I?
Yes, you did, but I can't blame you either. It's not the easiest, the most accessible language. The firm is called Hooghiemstra Partners, and we're a boutique consultancy. We're not a law firm, although all of us have law degrees, or actually multiple law degrees, quite a few of us. And we mostly provide consultancy on data matters. So lots of data protection and privacy, of course. Lots of healthcare law, because in healthcare, there's this matter of medical secrecy, but also on all the ongoing changes in EU law on data spaces and the whole more competition law angle to that. So that is, in a nutshell, what we do. And the vast majority of what we do is for governmental or semi-governmental entities. But we love to have startups as clients too, because even though the heart rate of a startup is entirely different than a government body, it's also a very refreshing other perspective on a lot of subjects. So that's more or less how it works.
Awesome. Thanks for that introduction. Welcome to the call, and I can't wait to discuss the Nym Privacy Statement with you. As usual, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for listening in. If you're watching the recording, then stay tuned, because this is going to be an interesting conversation. If you're watching live, if you have any questions for Walter, Casey, or myself, you can leave them in the chat. We're going to be doing a Q&A, as usual, at the end of the call. So you can leave your questions in the YouTube chat, also the Twitch chat, and we're also keeping an eye on the Nym Matrix server if you want to leave your questions anonymously and not log in with an account to YouTube. So with all of that said, you already gave us a bit of an intro, Walter, so I'm not going to ask you to introduce yourself, but I just wanted to ask you what led you to the decision to start working on privacy rights?
Basically, that's sort of wind back the clock to circa 2012. And I had been doing tons of ICT contracts, mostly procuring stuff, lots of SaaS and outsourcing contracting. And I was asked to look at the renewal, or basically the refactoring of a system that was covering tuberculosis dossiers, which is a contagious disease. And there are special rules around that this is called public health care, because of course you don't want people with a contagious disease running around in society. And what struck me a lot was basically finding out that the people that in Europe contract tuberculosis is mostly asylum seekers crossing the Mediterranean, people with serious drug issues, and quite often also inmates coming from what is called sub-Saharan Africa. The vast majority of cases of tuberculosis are covered by that. And these are not usually the people that are in a position to say no against collecting data or demand that their data is being taken care of in a good manner. And to me, this felt a lot more impactful than writing another contract on the implementation of an enterprise resource planning for COGS. And not to belittle the people that make COGS or gem pots or whatever. It's all very essential to society. But it felt more like this was to me a thing like this matters a lot more. This is more impactful to a lot of people's lives, and especially people that can't buy VPNs, or they just can't say no to the data being collected and shared and so on.
Yeah, that's a great reason, and thanks for sharing that with us. Now, I wanted to ask you about today we're gonna talk about the importance of privacy policies in general, and specifically, of course, what went into the considerations that went into designing Nym's privacy statement, which you had an important hand in, of course, and you advised it. So obviously, governments on one side and legal institutions play one role in protecting people's privacy. But on the other hand, what role and responsibility do you see companies specifically having in guaranteeing their users' privacy?
I think it's not so different. The main difference between governments and companies is that, of course, there's to some extent you get to choose your government, supposedly in a democratic society. But for companies, for the most part, you get to choose your providers. Again, monopolies and the likes aside. So there's a difference in power differentials there. But the rules are, especially regarding transparency, what data are you collecting, for what purposes, for how long, with whom do you share it, how can you exercise your rights. It's the same rules for governments, for most of governments and companies alike. There's one small group completely out of, not completely out of the realm, but that is law enforcement, intelligence services, defense. That's a different space. But the GDPR in Europe, and I'm taking Europe as a wider thing because Switzerland, for example, is de facto a GDPR country. And that's the same for Norway, Iceland, and so on. For most of Europe, that is the framework, and that framework applies to, let's say, civil government and companies alike.
You mentioned Europe, and that's an excellent segue into the next question I have planned for you. I don't know if you're familiar with Bart Pernille, who's a very he's a very close friend of Nym. He's also like part of the whole process that led to the inception of Nym. He's the PhD advisor of Claudia Diaz, our chief scientist, and he's been one of he was one of the true OGs of cryptography back when it was not even close to be what it is today. And what he likes to say is that the EU has two faces when it comes to privacy. And obviously, on one side, we have the aforementioned GDPR, which is a trend-setting regulation and probably one of the strongest like privacy regulations for online privacy that we see so far in the world. And then on the other hand, we have the constant push for like constantly recurring push for something like chat control, right? Which is deeply dystopian, and it seems to be. Oh wait, we lost Walter. There he is.
Yeah, apologies. I'm switching to Wi-Fi because apparently that is more trustworthy than wired connections here in this household.
Welcome back.
Okay,
Welcome back.
We were talking about Bart Pernille.
Yes, I was talking about Bart Pernille, and sorry for the audience. I'm going to repeat this because this is an important question. So, what Bart likes to say or mentions a lot of times, and I think it's very true, is that the EU has two faces when it comes to privacy. On one hand, we have GDPR, which can be considered a trend-setting privacy regulation. It's really like on the forefront of regulation that ensures end user privacy. And then on the other side, we have initiatives like chat control, which keeps coming back, right? In various different forms. Nobody actually wants it. You can't show me a single EU citizen who would say, "Yeah, I want chat control. I want client-side scanning. I want providers to it's like read my messages before they get encrypted." So there's this apparent asymmetry here, and I just wanted to ask your thoughts as someone who's very involved, in European legal practice regarding privacy, especially. What are your thoughts on this? Does the EU indeed have two faces of privacy? Which one is the stronger?
I would say that no government and the EU is a kind of a transnational. Not even a federation, confederation, but there's no such thing as a governments being monoliths. there's always competing interests and ideas, and apology for contradicting you. If you talk to certain children's rights groups, they love chat control, certain, not all of them. If you talk to a certain former film star who has a company selling age verification through AI, he loves chat control. That's Thorn with Ashton Kutcher at the head of it, and a lot of that what that happens makes one wonder about the appropriateness of the political decision making. But yeah, especially in law enforcement, there's a fundamental underappreciation of the need of our infrastructures to be robust. There's still this mythological belief that you can have golden keys and that you can have lawful access through backdoors, and that only they will be able to use the backdoors, which, as someone like Bart can explain much more eloquently than I can, and with much more authority because I'm merely a lawyer and not a computer scientist like Bart, is, I've been taught, mathematically impossible. But this is a recurring theme. And if I may segue a bit back to your earlier question, what a lot of people in companies forget is that any data they have and any data they collect will be accessible to at least their own government and maybe multiple governments. So if you feel questions like, what is the harm or how disproportionate is this? To give a very concrete example, ICE in the US is currently asking EdTech companies for data. There have been cases of menstruation app providers having been asked for data about abortions and so on. So whatever you do may on its own look not so super nefarious, but may become very nefarious if the wrong government gets its hands on it.
Exactly, that's right. This is one of the big like latent problems in collecting data about users. Not to mention just the fact that if you compile like a set of data about people, then it gains value immediately, and people can just straight up steal it. And that happens. I won't list all the examples, but you can just search data leak, and you will find hundreds of recent examples with varying severities. So that's a very good point. Turning to Casey for a second, I don't want to leave you out from the spotlight, my dear friend. So, I mean, you've been researching and writing about these new legislations like chat control, the aforementioned chat control, and also the current KYC legislation that is being considered in Switzerland, which is obviously something we as a Swiss company are keeping a very close eye on. And what's your take on how these types of laws will affect people? And can we as Nym do anything about them?
Yeah, so I mean, like maybe to quickly go back also to the earlier question about the responsibilities that companies have, that tech companies or any kind of company has that renders a digital service in relationship to governments. So we know that governments and tech companies are some of the largest data collectors. They're the largest data collectors on the planet. They're also the largest surveillance systems on the planet. So the question of responsibility is huge. Because a lot of our massive amounts of our personal lives in data are being exposed to third parties on a constant basis. One distinction between these kind of two big mammoth surveillance actors or data collection actors is that with companies, Nym being a company, this is super important for us to consider, is that companies have a kind of profit incentive to retain, collect, and expand their surveillance programs. So unfortunately, we don't really live in a form of capitalism anymore where it's simply concrete production that generates profit and surplus value. We live in a kind of abstracted realm where with surveillance capitalism, data itself is its own market. And this market is huge. So one responsibility that's very distinct for companies is not to be the exploiters of the data that they are handling from their own customers. And that's a big question about how to do that. And so going back to something Walter was saying is like in the previous response is that any data that is being held is at risk. in some way or another. That could just be by access by that could be accessed by national governments, foreign intelligence agencies, cyber criminals. The list is quite long. At Nym, one of our kind of our primary goals was to design a system, not just a privacy policy or statement, which is, we don't really want this to amount to a series of like marketing promises. Like, we actually wanted to build a system based on what we call purpose limitation. So to actually limit as much as possible the amount of personal data from our users that we are even exposed to. And by limiting that exposure, we remove the very risk infrastructurally and architecturally of data collection to begin with. And we think this is something that more companies should take seriously as a new kind of standard for what it means to handle people's data across the board. So that's one thing I would say. But the more specific question was on these new legislations. And so like these new kinds of legal legislations that are happening, whether it's we've been talking a lot about chat control for the last 2 years, while it's currently dead in its current form. We know that it will resurrect itself in another form later on. This coming year is actually going to be a big one. So again, we might have had a few month break, but it's just a break. In Switzerland, where Nym is legally based, we have a new set of legislation that was introduced, I think, around July of 2025 last year.
Just proposed so far as I know.
It's just this is just legislation proposal, just like chat control is legislation proposal. We're not talking about a firmly established legal statute that's going to require companies to behave in one way or another yet. But what's being called the Legal Entities Transparency Act, I think it has a longer name, but that's the short name for it, which would, in essence, require companies with something like a certain minimum of customers. I think it's 5,000 in this case. To KYC, or know your customer, to collect personal information on their users for the sake of transparency and various languages of responsibility, etc. So what does that mean for companies? And what does that mean for Nym? That's a big question. But the point I would note is that in both of these cases, in chat control and with this legislation in Switzerland, these are legislations that are being pitched to the public as reactions and defenses against certain kinds of evils in society. With chat control, it's trying to stop sexual predators or against children. In Switzerland, this legislation comes out of an anti-money laundering bill. It's a modification of an anti-money laundering bill. And so again, in certain cases, these are real social problems. We don't want to say that these are not social problems. The problem is that people are being asked to sacrifice their rights to privacy in order to defend society against a smaller amount of bad actors. Nym doesn't think that this is not a fair or reasonable social resolution to these problems. There are resolutions to these problems. The abuse of children, tax evasion, and whatever else problems arise from money laundering. But we do not think that people should be asked to give up their rights to protect their personal information, especially when that personal information is being exploited systematically online. And so Nym's goal, at least, and we think other companies' goal would be to reduce on our side our very exposure to who you are.
That is well said, and there was a lot said there. So I want to allow Walter to reflect on any of that before we move on to the Nym privacy policy.
Yeah, to add a little bit to the doom and gloom, there are noises being made in policy circles about age verification for social media in general. Again, know your customer like ideas, and again, with all the baggage and problems that comes with that, that's the current mood in Brussels is much more feeling like taking revenge on the tech sector, for which the tech sector has largely itself to blame for, by and large. but that doesn't mean that any intervention is a good intervention in that space.
That's a great point. Actually, it's very relevant here. Sorry, did I cut you off, Walter?
No, you didn't. I muted myself.
And
All right, excellent.
Another point that's, I think, worth mentioning is that I think it's important not to, in this public debate about things like chat control or KYC laws, I think it's important not to conclude that things like age verification are in themselves wrong. I think that in principle, there should be nothing wrong with needing, in a certain kind of case, to verify a piece of information. The real problem is that in doing that, we actually put people at risk by, in this case, requiring a third party with very little security infrastructure in place to safeguard information that they're being exposed to. When they handle millions and millions of people's, for instance, driver's license or passport photos or things like this. There are actually secure cryptographic ways, like zero-knowledge proofs, of which Nym has one version of, to verify simple facts without actually exposing large amounts of other personal information that is not the target in the process, and then leaving that on cryptographically unsecure systems for anyone to come along and violate or expose or exploit. That's one point of discussion, I would say.
May I push back a little on that?
Go ahead.
One of the solutions being discussed in the age verification space is using the OD wallet under the AIDAS regulation, which involves selective disclosure in many ways, thanks to the other Bart Jacobs. Yeah, there's two Barts in the cryptographic space, and the other one is a professor at Radboud University in Nijmegen, and his research group were the basis of the Irma kind of concept. I reveal my attributes, which ties very much into what Casey just mentioned. I'm still somewhat skeptical about that because it still reeks to me of techno-solutionism. And having been involved with, for example, the COVID passes during the Corona years, and at the time genuinely believing this might be helpful, and then it turned out not to be proportionate from my perspective, because you're fundamentally sleepwalking yourself into a papers, please society. And of course, a cigarette vending machine, it will be good to have some check that you're 18 plus if you're in a jurisdiction where you can't buy cigarettes if you're under 18. But the risks of, again, over-collecting or over-verifying is a very real risk.
Actually, the Papers, Please society is such a great point in this balancing act of, on the surface of it, right? It looks like something like the Corona check system, which I know that you were deeply involved in. It looks like on the face of it, it looks like an unquestionable social good. We have to know whether this person was checked for the virus lately. We got to know whether they were vaccinated or not. But this, in turn, does build habits, right? One of the things that people like to bring up when it comes to online anonymity and free access to the internet and all of that good stuff is that tugged under these initiatives, such as the one that Discord now launched to age verify everyone in their user base, about 6 months after a massive leak, by the way, which they were responsible for, and leaked I don't even know how many like images of people's IDs and other highly personal sensitive information. Just saying. So if you have Discord and a bunch of others doing this, then you have all of a sudden a habit in people that, when I want to access this or that, then I'm pulling out, my government ID, and that's just how things are. And that habit in and of itself, what you call the Papers, Please society, is a danger, and I agree with that. Gentlemen, this is a lovely conversation, so I want to give it more space if you have anything to add before we jump right into the Nym Privacy Statement.
Yeah, I would just say that I agree with Walter's concern there. And as a philosopher, I think that any of these decisions, for instance, to instantiate or deploy age verification for a particular kind of service. These need to be considered. These need to be considered democratically as social mechanisms with to be legitimated socially, and we need to have them considered first of all as forms of control. In a lot of cases, these are attempts by governments to control how information is accessed, distributed, and ultimately to control how people live. And in a lot of cases, these are I consider these oversteps of power. And we shouldn't feel also constrained. We shouldn't constrain our thinking to see, for instance, the effects of something like chat control or client-side scanning as just targeting sexual predators. It also has, or age verification, for instance. It also doesn't simply block access to pornographic sites. It also blocks access to lots of other services, for instance, suicide hotlines or suicide websites, which young teens might need urgently in their lives. And so I think this is the complexity of these situations needs to be considered socially. And this is simply not being done. This is part of the problem. These things are being deployed in sort of a blanket sweeping operation, and that's something we seriously need to push back on.
And if I may add to that, it's also part of a trend to push enforcement issues of existing rules towards the private sector, which almost by definition leads to over-enforcement. So it's not necessarily nefarious civil servants that want to control your internet use. It's more the dismissal of complexity or nuance and trying to shift the problem away.
Yeah. There's even an argument to be made that the complexity here is just inherently way too big to even consider. And, the foundational rule that everybody should be able to access the internet with no ID checks and all the tools that are on the internet is actually a defensible one just from a human rights perspective almost. I would love to have you both back for a continuation of this discussion. But what I'm really keen on jumping into now is the Nym Privacy Statement, which is of course, it is just words at the end of the day. So technology should, and in our case, I think it does, protect your privacy in like a fundamental technological way. I guess our audience already knows all the things that Nym does on the technological level to assure that, but it is still an important document. So my first question about the privacy statement is to you, Casey, and maybe also to you, Walter, to some extent. Why is it a statement and not a policy? What is the difference between privacy statement and privacy policy?
I guess one way you can think about it is that in a way, the word policy suggests a set of things that a company or an institution is dedicating itself to try to do. And that could be, in the end, just a set of promises. They might be quite trustworthy in carrying out that policy, but there's still the question of whether or not that could change. A statement is a bit more strict in a certain kind of way. So I think the way we wrote Nym's privacy policy was to try to make clear to Nym users how the system is designed to protect your privacy by default, and to stipulate exactly how that happens at each stage, and also to situate Nym as a company within the legal jurisdictions of which it's liable, like any company will be, whether that's in Switzerland or the larger legal agreements and associations that the country of Switzerland is itself a signatory. So we wanted to be as clear as possible just what this meant for actual users of Nym VPN in this case when they turn on the app.
I would, to add on what Casey just said, frame it more as your privacy statement is sort of the tip of the iceberg. As in, it's you're being transparent about what you're doing and for what purposes and by what means. And there's a lot ongoing at lower levels in the iceberg to make that happen. And I consider policy, yes, of course, it's kind of written policy, but what an organization does is in a way also policy. And you're not helping by your end users by explaining what you do to vet endpoints in Nym VPN ecosystem. But I'm also pretty sure that you do have safeguards in place for those endpoints. And that's a level of detail that is not helpful in a privacy statement. And Casey, not to rain on your parade, but my favorite privacy statement is privacy.lego.com, no, kids.lego.com, because it's a stop motion animation of Captain Lego explaining cookies to the Lego audience. And of course, Lego, massive company, not unlimited money, but tons of money. But it's an example of what a privacy statement for is. It's geared towards the audience, it's geared towards children, and it explains in terms understandable to children what's going on with cookies on the kids.lego site. Of course,
Sorry, go ahead. I'm just finding the link real quick so that I can share this with the audience. Go ahead.
Of course, the Nym VPN audience is much more sophisticated, so you can also refrain to some more text-oriented stuff. But I think both examples sort of encapsulate what you're trying to do. You try to explain in not overly complex terms what you do about the topic. Have you lost Simon?
Apologies, gentlemen.
Show us later, Simon.
Not sure what happened there. I think we all disconnected for a second, or was it only me?
Only you.
I missed it, but I did find the link, so I'm gonna share that with the audience. I didn't know about this. This is incredibly cool. So thanks for sharing that, Walter. And I also take it that ours is not your favorite privacy statement.
No, this is of course a nasty remark to make in a call like this. I've also been pushing on one of the privacy officers of Red Bull to make a Red Bull style animation about die privacy statements. But that's, I mean, that would be awesome.
I don't think it is. I'll tell you why I don't think it is. It is a great way to illustrate the purpose of what you actually explained also in words. The purpose of a privacy statement, right? Yeah. Like you said, it's the tip of the iceberg, but that tip of the iceberg should be in the simplest possible and most straightforward way, informing people what the rest of the iceberg is. And this example, which I just shared with the audience in the chat, so make sure to check it out, is a prime example of this. Very, very cool. Thanks for that example. Casey, go ahead.
Yeah, but I just realized this now, but actually, I mean, we spent some time talking and thinking about this internally, actually, in Nym. On the one hand, we were considering making a much shorter version that would speak to the general user in the most direct and clear possible way, and to not overly display the technical details at the legal and infrastructural level, where people can get lost and basically not get the information they want because there's too much information or it's too technical. So that was a big consideration. But on the other argument, which we were considering, was that in a way, if we don't present the complexity in a clear way, we would actually be obstructing transparency, and we would actually be hiding things from people that they would benefit from knowing. And so we tried to strike a balance between these two things, and that I think is the current form of the statement.
Yeah, Casey's very right about it. This is a massive trade-off between precision, clarity, accessibility, and there's probably no ideal privacy statement. I have been guilty of writing too much legalese in privacy statements, and has taught me a new learned appreciation of communications professionals. These are actually quite hard to get right.
This is just, to me personally, this conversation is fascinating because, reading our privacy statement, I never thought of this aspect of it, that it's more so than other legal documents we have. It has to be a pretty concentrated effort in communication as well. I never considered this, so this is mind-blowing to me. Thanks for sharing that, gentlemen. All right, so question to you, Casey, and I think Walter, since you're so involved, you could also answer this one. A big concern with any digital service, I guess, on the internet is whether a company can access user data, right, and what they can do with it. And I guess the question above that is whether they collect user data. So, in the strictest technical sense, does Nym collect user data?
Yeah, we so this what we're talking about today in terms of what was actually updated is the privacy policy for Nym VPN. Nym also has a privacy policy for any information that's exposed on nym.com. We also have statements for our operators and our operators' terms and conditions, which we talked about last week. But in terms of this one, the Nym VPN app does collect information if you consent to share it through the app. For the sole purposes of improving the app. And I think any piece of technology is going to need feedback from actual users about how that app is functioning, where they are, under what conditions, so that the service will actually function for them. And in the end, privacy protections for a piece of technology are only relevant if that technology actually works. The key with Nym is that this data that's collected, if you consent to share it with us, is completely anonymous. It is unlinkable to you as a person because your account itself is architecturally unlinkable to who you are. That's the kind of the groundwork that allows us to safely say, yes, we do collect information from your app, a limited amount of information that's only relevant to improving the app itself, and that it's consensually shared, but also that in doing so, it's perfectly safe because it has been disconnected from who you are and any personal identification that could link you in whatever case by a third party.
What Casey just did was also touching upon what I spend way too much of my time on discussions on linkability or not. And my understanding of the Nym VPN mixnet situation, if you do not consent to this telemetry, and even with the telemetry, but it's a slightly different use case, this is probably as good as it gets in terms of minimizing metadata. You could always argue that fundamentally any internet connection that comes with some baggage in terms of traffic data and so on. The question is, how ephemeral is it and how meaningful can it be? And in the context of a mixnet, mixnet mostly exists to remove all meaning from the metadata and the traffic data. At the same time, if I had been approached by one of the other VPN companies that claim that you are saving yourself from everything else, every threat out there, I would not have accepted the commissioning of reviewing the privacy statement. There's too many players in the VPN space that make exaggerated claims.
That is very true. Not going to throw shade, at any competitor. That's I think that's not a nice thing to do, but that is definitely true. If you just look around in the ad space, for example, how VPNs advertise themselves, it's full of false claims. We try to be very clear in our communications of where Nym fits in the whole stack of privacy tools that you could be using and what it exactly does and how. And that a big tool in that is the privacy statement. I want to switch gears a little bit, although it's of course very deeply related to what we've been discussing so far. Walter, the next one is for you. So we mentioned, I think it's a PII, personally identifiable information, personally identifying information. It's I guess it's maybe a synonym to personal data, and I just wanted to ask you where the line is drawn between just data about me versus PII. Whether the distinction is even important. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, first of all, that you have just triggered me massively because I bloody hate the term PII.
Sorry about that. Apologies.
Yeah. It's the same as the term data privacy. It's also And sorry for any Americans in this conversation and in the audience. It's all too bloody American to me. Sorry, Casey. That's the. In Europe, we talk about personal data, and by the way, the protection of personal data is not everything there is to privacy. There's much more to privacy than personal data, and not everything about personal data is privacy oriented. Okay, this is the kind of the lawyer who goes all theological, how many angels fit on the tip of a syringe. The thing is, by and large, for most practical terms and intents and purposes, yes, DPIA sort of overlaps the personal data definition. And there has been quite a bit of jurisprudence, and one of the, again, less great attempts currently ongoing is to incorporate the jurisprudence in ways that create more leeway into the GDPR. But the long-term short linkability, the ability to single out, and now if there's any lawyers in the audience, they will be screaming that it is not the proper definition either. But for a technical audience, the ability to single out is a very decent criterion, and I should add, it is considered a subjective definition. So if you give data that on your end is definitely singling out people, but on the other hand, it is not singling out at all, and it is really, really difficult to collect additional data to again single out the people involved, then for legal intents and purposes, this should be considered anonymous data. But I'm also going to add, in the past 10 or 15 years or so, I've seen so many claims about data being anonymous, when it was bleedingly obvious it was not. So I tend to just not believe people when they claim something is anonymous.
And I mean, most legal definitions of personal data and personally identifying data, they as Walter said, they hinge on a certain kind of technological ability to be able to say this, you are being identified here in this way. But let's consider a different kind of technological means of identification. Like, let's consider them like the mass amounts of metadata that's being exposed when we do anything online. So on its own, that metadata doesn't say our name. It doesn't. It might have disparate aspects of who we are, our location, our IP address, et cetera, all attached to various different types of activities online. But you can't necessarily point to a certain batch of it and say, oh yeah, that belongs to so-and-so at this address. Yet, if you compile it over large amounts of time with advanced AI systems that are able to process it in increasingly sophisticated ways, that set of metadata coming from your computer or your phone can actually reveal way more about you than just your name ever would. It's actually way more personally revealing. It can, when you analyze things like what your cursor is doing on a web page over 2 years, across devices, across platforms, it can actually reveal political ideas. It can reveal desires. It can reveal personal situations in your life, like your medical history, all from seemingly random bits of information that are actually rich in patterns. And so even though things like metadata are not protected by the same kinds of laws that protect personally identifying information, Walter can correct me here. It is, my only point is that it is super revealing about who we are.
In a way, metadata is considered personal data under the GDPR. In the EU framework, and Switzerland has also adopted that in a telecommunications context, there's actually more restrictions on metadata than on other categories of data for precisely these reasons. And this was also why, for example, the Data Retention Directive was struck down, because the highest court of the European Union rightfully said metadata is way more revealing about you than the content of the communication. And that loops back to my earlier theology exposure. This touches also on notions of confidentiality of communications. And Casey's absolutely right. In the long term, it becomes exceedingly revealing. Just to give an example, the last time I looked at the literature on geodata, and this was already 5 or 6 years ago, there were studies that if there's 19 locations, you know it's the same person, and the time slots, you can point out the person. Just 19 geo coordinates plus timestamps. That's enough. And you can imagine if those geo coordinates involve places of worship, it tells a lot about other things about you as well. Because if you go to church every Sunday, then it will be visible what kind of church you're visiting, or whether you've been attending protests, or whether you're in certain football venues or not. It will be quite easily to correlate that you're a fan of a certain sports club.
I have to throw in since we're talking about jurisdictions, I want to throw in a last question that I have for you, Walter, before we jump into the community questions for the end with the Q&A. In the Nym Privacy Statement, we mention third countries, and we just talked about jurisdictions, right? I just wanted to ask, why is the legal jurisdiction important here? And maybe also we could talk about what the difference is between, an EU jurisdiction and Switzerland, given that you mentioned that in so many ways there's an overlap. Is Switzerland better in any way than the EU at large?
I would say the air quality is much better, and the looks of the landscape.
True.
Cost of living, we may have differences of opinion here, but it's complicated. Basically, you have this kind of boring concept called the European Economic Area, which is the EU plus Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Andorra. For all intents and purposes, all these EU legislations, or laws like the GDPR and the e-privacy framework, are just transposed in these 4 countries as well. So if you're in Iceland and proudly not a member of the EU, it's still part of the rules. The EU-Switzerland relationship is way more complicated. There's more like the 2 crazy axes still not being able to split up from each other. And it's done on a dossier per dossier basis. And technically, Switzerland is considered for data protection and privacy rules a third country, but it is also deemed to be adequately having implemented protections that make it equivalent to the EU protections. And for example, this would be impossible for a country like China or India or Vietnam. Japan has that status. There's a few others. There are also a few others that have that status, but may not necessarily deserve that. But then we will go into geopolitics again. So let's leave it at that. So yes, from both an EU citizen perspective or EU resident, and from a Swiss residency perspective, on this topic, Switzerland is more or less part of the EU family.
Thank you for that answer. I would love to ask a bit more into this one. Actually, I will probably have to, if you agree, I will probably have to bring you back on another call to discuss a bit more broadly this general set of topics. Are you down?
If I have recovered from this bloody flu, then we can talk again about that.
Okay, all right. We'll keep that in mind. I'll keep you to that. Yes. Thank you so much. And with that, let's jump into the Q&A. Ladies and gentlemen, you can still leave any burning questions you have in the chat. We're gonna be picking them up in the order they come in. So first, we have a question from Rocio, our beloved community contributor. The question is: if an AI is trained on my data and I later exercise my right to be forgotten, has that data actually been deleted if the AI still remembers the patterns of my life? I think that's a great question.
It is a great question, and it's a question that is bound to end up in front of the courts. The problem is we don't really know, and I'm sort of rephrasing, and hope I don't do a disservice to Rocio's question, that this is about LLMs and similar neural network-oriented technology. We don't really know what happens inside them.
Nobody knows.
But it looks a bit like it's a very lossy compression. And I would take the position, but like I said, it's a great question. This will go through the courts. But I would argue that, yes, your right to be forgotten or your right to deletion, if these patterns are still in there and allow for singling out you, I would argue that deletion request has not been honored.
The other big question is whether it can be honored, given the fact that we have no idea how Rosia's private information is represented in the model itself.
And this is one of those big tensions. I mean, the fundamental notion of technology underlying data protection law and stems much more from an era of you do realize that a lot of the basics have been set around the early 70s. When people are afraid of big mainframes in the hands of large corporations and governments, creating a surveillance state. So this notion of the current level of chatbots and so on, that was absolute sci-fi. And the law is just not compatible with that technology at all.
It's been a hot minute. So many levels. It's been a hot minute since the 70s. In a lot of ways, the world changed just a little bit. Just a little bit. Thank you for the great question, Rocio, and thank you for the answer, Walter. Next question is from Ginny. Good to see you back. Thanks for the question. Dystopian times. Are there any laws coming that we can be truly happy about? I think this is also a great question. I should have left it for the end, so for once we don't close on a doom and gloom note.
I currently, because the if this question had been asked, let's say 2 years ago, I would have given 4 or 5 examples. And right now, there's a broad effort to kind of roll back the progress made in the past 5 years or even more. So I'm afraid I cannot. Maybe I can think of one later on, but although I would say that in the space of digital sovereignty and open source, there is some stuff ongoing that may result in stuff that, at least personally, as a person that likes the underlying ethos of open source and so on, that may improve. But broadly speaking, it's a bit doomy and gloomy.
All right, so back to doom and gloom it is then. Go ahead, Casey. Sorry.
I'm also a doom and gloom enthusiast, but for the sake of argument, I would say we shouldn't forget that some laws are created by cohorts of politicians for their own interests or the interests of particular groups in society. But in principle, laws can be proposed from the ground up. Laws can be initiated from the grassroots level, and so in principle, there could be good laws coming if we build them. And those could also be laws that do things like protect privacy and data online, but it could be any law. But it requires people to mobilize against a threat to their livelihood. And I think as long as that possibility is there, there's still room to have a little bit of hope.
Oh, and on that note, for example, when the AI Act was under development, everyone looking into space knew that face recognition in public spaces would be a hot potato in there, for obvious reasons. The European civil society people banded together and started an EU citizens initiative called Reclaim Your Face. The EU Citizens Initiative is basically, if you gather enough signatures of enough EU citizens with a certain distribution, then the Commission has to consider making a legislative proposal. It's a very weak way of getting bottom-up legislation, but it is, as I will explain, a very important signal. This EU Citizens Initiative, by the way, failed miserably in terms of collecting enough signatures. But the mere fact that it was going on and it met earlier thresholds of becoming an official EU Citizens Initiative, and it was ongoing, forced more or less the hands of the European Commission to actually restrict the use of face recognition in public spaces in the AI Act, which of course got watered down by our friends in law enforcement a bit. It's not perfect, but it is an example that involvement by citizens of the European Union, signaling that their human rights are important. The chat control dossier is another example. The people calling their MEPs, mailing them, writing, getting the press to write it about that. These are very important components of a democratic society. This actual involvement of citizens.
And
Yes.
going back to Rocio's point, we should also not forget the history of the way in which the right to be forgotten started from people organizing on a really, really local level to make it all the way into the biggest privacy defense law in the world.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing up the European Citizens Initiative. I dropped the link for those who are Europeans and are interested in starting one or maybe be involved in one. Then you can check the link that I shared in the chat. It's a great mechanism to trigger change within the EU, or at least start certain conversations. I will add one not doom and gloom thing here. So in this landscape of doom and gloom when it comes to privacy, digital privacy, we're hearing it from all different sources. If you follow people like Techlore, for example, an excellent group who are doing privacy-focused and security-focused content, and even our community and like most communities in this space are growing late 2025 and early 2026 like never before. So awareness to these issues that we're discussing here and that the stuff that we're fighting for here is at never before seen levels. So actually, that in and of itself can be driving change, right? So, for example, if the aforementioned Citizens Initiative would start today, maybe it would pass. Maybe more people, it would reach that threshold of attention that more people would sign it. I think that's a very real thing. I think we're becoming a true movement, not just some weird people, wearing hoodies that people give weird looks to, what do you have to hide? Why do you want privacy? But it's actually becoming a legitimate movement. And I think our times have a lot to do with that. So that's my silver lining. Thank you for the great question, Ginny. Moving on to the next one from Alexei. Does the Nym policy need to be updated in the future or will it stay the same? Great question.
I think with any policy or statement that I think we have as a company, we want to stay open to the fact that it might need to be updated if laws change, if social situations change, if our technology changes or the needs for more advanced features or more protections change, if there's new situations with data exposure. We need to be able to be flexible, but I think what won't change is the dedication behind the policy itself. The dedication that built the infrastructure, which is this is a piece of technology that is designed to protect your privacy and the integrity of your data. And in doing so, it is designed also to protect you from any company, from Nym itself. So I think the spirit of that is something that's going to stay the same. But if the details of telemetry data collection changes, we're dedicated to being completely transparent with all users that this has changed. But the anonymity behind it is, I think, a core guiding principle in what we're doing.
I have nothing to add to what Casey just said because he said it very eloquently.
All right, excellent. And thanks for the question, Alexei. The next one is also by you, and this will be the last question we have time for today. Next question again is also from Alexei. If Europe is starting to love surveillance, what hope does the rest of the world have?
I was hoping for less of doom and gloom at the end.
Actually true.
Now, it is one of the arguments being made continuously about the various digital omnibuses now being discussed in Brussels. The very fact that they have been proposed have been detrimental to the standing of the European Union abroad. Because why would we adhere to this golden GDPR standard if you feel it's too complicated yourself and you're going to water it down? Looking at the other large democracies, India still has an extremely long way to come on privacy legislation. Their highest court only recognized a fundamental right or constitutional right to privacy about 5 or 6 years ago, slightly longer. No tradition whatsoever. Brazil is sort of on paper on par with Europe, but given the back and forth between certain political ideologies there. I would not necessarily immediately consider emigrating to Brazil myself. So yes, we have to make do with Europe, I'm afraid.
All right.
I'd also
Go
add
ahead, Casey.
I would also add one quick point that, like, personally, I think that like governments and laws are really important institutions for protecting people's rights. But in a lot of cases, it can be quite slow and maybe might never arrive, those protections. And so I don't think that people should wait for governments to step in to defend themselves. And technology is one way in which people can get the tools they need as tools of self-defense. And Nym is just one of those. There's a whole ecosystem. There is now a whole rising ecosystem of privacy tools that you can use every day to defend every piece of data that leaves your device. Sometimes you need a suite. Sometimes you need a stack of tools to do so properly. But the hope for the rest of the world, the hope for anywhere, is that the tools of resistance against surveillance are being built, and they're being made available, and that they're open source, and that they're affordable. And I think there's a big hope there.
I would also say that in other parts of the world, there's no less community organization ongoing than in Europe. Sometimes more so than in Europe itself. And that's also worth thinking about. It is laws, it's technology, it is engaged citizens.
That's a very good point, and I think it's a great note to end on, because finally we managed to find something that was not doomy and gloomy. So excellent stuff, gentlemen. There, well done. And with that, I would like to thank you both for coming on today. I would like to ask you, Walter, is there any social media, maybe blog or whatever that you're doing that people should follow if they're interested in your work?
I'm on LinkedIn because I have to. And I'm on Mastodon. I'll toss you over, but that's more of a personal thing. So I'll see about getting you links. That's
okay. Excellent.
I've sort of left the microblogging sphere, and I also regret that it's being streamed on X for very obvious reasons.
Yeah. We on paper we get to choose our platforms, but actually, the eyeballs choose the platform, unfortunately, which is the big problem.
There's a chicken and egg issue, obviously.
Exactly. Yes. With that said, once again, big thanks for coming on to both of you. The last thing that I have to do here is to give people their little NFT, a commemoration of this hangout that we had together for this event. So, drum roll, the secret phrase for today is going to be, I'm not pronouncing it again. Say it, Walter.
Hooghiemstra.
Hooghiemstra. Yes. Thank you so much. That means a lot, actually. So you know where to go. You need to go to nym.com/go/POAP, and the secret phrase is Hooghiemstra. Ladies and gentlemen, with all of that said, we are going to say goodbye. Thank you for joining us today, and see you in a week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.